Alrighty, guys. So this is Module 7, Research Design and Ethics in Psychology. Okay, so research design. So in psychological research, really there are no questions that are off limits with a few exceptions. So the only things that we don't study in psych are things that we cannot test, like whether ghosts are real, is there an afterlife, things like that, as well as unethical questions, meaning ones that we can't actually inflict intentional harm upon someone just for the sake of science, especially long-lasting harm. So the steps of choosing a research design is that once researchers choose their question, they have to basically choose which study method is going to be most appropriate. Is it going to be experimental, correlational? Are they going to use a case study, a naturalistic observation? Are they going to compare twins? Maybe if they want to get at a nature-nurture kind of question. Are they going to use longitudinal or cross-sectional, which we'll talk about more in our development unit, but that's when you either study the same group of people for a long time or different age groups all at the same time. So researchers have some things to consider. First, they have to consider what's the most effective method to test the question I'm asking. Also, money and time is an issue for a lot of these, and then also ethical issues. After that, they will need to create some operational definitions of the mental or behavioral processes that they are looking to study. And they have to really make sure that there are not any confounding variables, or that if there are, that they control for those, which is why in experiments, we have to use random assignment so that we eliminate as much of a potential to have some confounding variables. And here's a little table that might help you to kind of understand the difference between these different methods. So the difference between a descriptive, a correlational method, and an experimental method. So I would suggest writing that down as well. Okay, now, in understanding everyday behavior, sometimes it might not make sense totally, because what a psychologist may do in a lab to try to understand behavior might seem very artificial. But that's kind of on purpose, because in a laboratory experiment, we want the ability to be able to control as many factors as we can, so that the only things that are being affected are the variables that we're trying to test. So a lab is supposed to be basically a simplified reality that allows one to simulate and control important features of everyday life. I wrote similar, that's a typo, simulate. Now, the purpose of an experiment is really not to recreate the exact behaviors of everyday life. That would be more like a naturalistic observation if we wanted to just see how people behave in their everyday life. But rather, experiments, their goals are more so to test theoretical principles. So, for example, let's say in an aggression study, they operationally define if a person is willing to, give a noise blast to someone as an aggressive act. Well, giving a noise blast to someone is a different behavior than slapping someone in the face, right? But it still gets at that underlying principle of aggression. If you're willing to do that to somebody, it probably makes you a little bit more likely to also be willing to slap somebody than somebody who wasn't willing to do any of that at all. So the take-home point of this is that psychological science focuses less on identifying specific behaviors than on revealing general principles. The goal is to reveal general principles that can explain a variety of behaviors rather than just very specific ones like slapping. The goal would be more to understand aggression as a principle. Also, here's another graph that I just thought was really helpful that might help you to understand some of the advantages and disadvantages of a bunch of different types of methods. You don't have to write it all down, but this might be helpful to study with later for your test. Okay, so in psychology, there are ethical standards that we have to make sure that we meet when studying both animals and humans. So when psychologists study animals, there's a couple different reasons why they might do that. First of all, they might be just interested in the animal and their specific behaviors and kind of thought patterns and processes. Another reason is maybe they want to know the similarities between this animal's behaviors and human behaviors. And another big reason why animals are studied is kind of in place of humans. So let's say we want to test a new medication, we might test them on animals rather than on humans, especially if the animal has a similar processing system, like a nervous system or heart, for example, as humans do. And that's what the medicine is intended to help. Now, there are some people, animal protection advocates, who believe that animals should not be used in any psychological, biological, or medical research. And there are valid points on each side of this argument. These are the issues that arise from this debate. Is it right to place the well-being of humans above that of other animals? And what safeguards should be put in place to protect animals? So, for example, is it ethical for us to give mice tumors so that we can study cancer drugs on them in hopes of helping humans with cancer get rid of their tumors? Same thing with AIDS. Is it ethical for us to give an HIV similar virus to a monkey in order to try to develop a vaccine against it? These are the questions that psychologists and ethics committees have to determine. Now, the BPS, which is the British Psychological Society, they say that if you're doing animal research, you have to house the animals in reasonably natural living conditions and give companions for animals that are social creatures. The APA, which is the American Psychological Association, states that researchers must give humane care and healthful conditions, and testing should minimize discomfort. Now, at most universities, there is a program where people have to get their research approved before they can run the study, because we want to make sure that ethics are being protected. But beyond that, we just have to make sure that these ethical guidelines are maintained. Now, for studying humans, a lot of it is the same, but there is some more stuff we do as well. One thing is that we have to try to minimize the amount of stress and or deception in a research study unless absolutely necessary. So the ethics code of the APA says that researchers must obtain informed consent, meaning if you're going to do a study on a human, you need to tell them kind of the basics of what's going to happen in the study so they can decide if they want to do this or not. Now, sometimes there is allowed a little bit of lying, but the lying has to be justified, and it cannot be like a huge lie. Also, the research has to protect participants from greater than usual harm and discomfort. You have to keep participants' personal information confidential, because there have been times where researchers have not done that. And you must fully debrief people, meaning you have to, once you have gotten your data from that individual, you have to let them know kind of what you were doing, why you were doing it, and how they played a part in your research. Now, institutional review boards are those ethics committees that I was speaking about earlier that are usually conducted at universities, and they're made up of people of all different backgrounds, and they screen proposals and make sure human participants' rights aren't being violated, and that the research proposal is ethical. So this is really important because it basically serves as a screening to make sure that nothing unethical gets passed. Because there was a time in psychological science, as we're going to learn soon in class, that there have been studies done that are very unethical, extremely unethical. And so in order to prevent that from happening, IRBs are made today, and they have to approve the research before conducting it. Now, the values in psychology, every person has their own values, and the values that we carry as individuals do affect what we study, how we study it, and how we interpret results. And sometimes this can mean we will see what we want or expect to see. However, sometimes people think psychology is going to be used for like evil purposes. And though psychology does have the power to deceive, really psychology's purpose is to enlighten, to help us understand humans in general. And every day, psychologists explore ways to enhance learning, creativity, and compassion. Now, I have a picture of these two famous psychologists who did some really groundbreaking research. So this is Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark, sorry. And this couple were psychologists who studied internalized racism in children. And from their research, they testified in the court case, Brown versus Board of Education, that desegregated schools. And it was based on their research that this desegregation happened, which was such a good thing, for our country, a good step in the right direction. And so this is the kind of thing that psychology is looking to do, to enlighten us, to make us better as a society. Yeah. Now, I'd like you to test yourself with these questions, and we'll talk more about this in class. See ya.